Good day to you from the Ohio School Boards Association studio in Columbus, Ohio. I'm your host, Crystal Davis. I have the honor of introducing a very distinguished presenter today, Mr. Stephen Menendian. Welcome. He is the Assistant Director of the Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society at the University of California-Berkeley, and he's here to tell us all about exciting new policies designed to help school districts across Ohio promote diversity in many ways. Certainly very important topics you're going to discuss with us today, and I know you have a lot of ground to cover, so I'm going to let you go ahead and get started.
Thanks, Crystal, and thanks to ODE for inviting me here to talk with you for a few minutes today about the state's new diversity policy and guidance. This brief presentation has three parts. First, I will review the history of equal educational opportunity in Ohio and how the new Diversity Strategies policy continues those efforts. Second, I will describe the changing demographics and many of the looming educational challenges in the state. Third, I will emphasize the importance of diversity and inclusive educational environments for Ohio schools and school children. In a separate webinar, I will introduce the Diversity Strategies policy and guidance. For almost 30 years, Ohio has sought to promote equal educational opportunities in the state of Ohio through a policy developed in the 1970s and adopted in 1980. In 1978, the Ohio State Board of Education adopted a resolution asserting the state's support for student diversity and the alleviation of racial isolation in Ohio schools, and directed ODE to develop a policy for the alleviation of racial isolation and the promotion of diversity. The resolution asked ODE to develop a policy that would be of use to local districts. In 1980, the State Board adopted ODE's policy entitled Equal Educational Opportunity in Ohio Schools, a guide for school districts on constitutional provisions, assessment procedures, and monitoring activities pertaining to racial isolation. This policy was a guide for school districts and directed districts to pursue activities designed to reduce racial isolation in Ohio schools. This is known as the 1980 policy. Following the 2007 United States Supreme Court decisions and Parents Involved in Community Schools versus Seattle School District No. 1, the Ohio State Board of Education suspended the 1980 policy pending a review with further recommendations to inform the development of a new policy. The Supreme Court clarified the parameters of law relevant to guidance offered by the 1980 policy. After inviting experts to explain the Supreme Court's new ruling with respect to diversity and race, the State Board of Education of Ohio engaged BASA, ODE, and the Kirwan Institute to work together to craft a proposal that would become the Diversity Strategies for Successful Schools project. Among the objectives of the Diversity Strategies project proposal were to facilitate dialogue among district leadership on diversity strategies and nurture leadership at the district level that will advance diversity strategies, an examination of the historical experience with integration and an assessment of what diversity means in the 21st century, and build capacity and reinforce the commitment to diversity in the education community. The proposal set forth first a review and audit of the 1980 policy, including a review of its educational effectiveness and an appraisal of its compliance with recent federal law. Second, an evaluation of the current challenges to diversity in Ohio. Third, an analysis of best practices in educational literature and research, and conduct an audit of efforts in the state to create a more inclusive learning environment. Fourth, develop a comprehensive set of recommendations for possible new policy formulation. And finally, create a webinar for the Diversity Strategies project. This proposal became the Diversity Strategies for Successful Schools project and was accepted by the Martha Holding Jennings Foundation, which provided grant support and funding for this collaboration. As part of the audit of the 1980 policy, we reviewed ODE files which described district-level activities under the policy. However, they were largely statistical and did not contain much of a qualitative or evaluative component. Consequently, ODE administered an electronic survey designed to gauge the impact of the 1980 policy, including how it was received and understood. As part of the development of district-level feedback, ODE held meetings in 4 regions in March and April of 2010. Due to facility space constraints, a representative mix of urban, suburban, and rural districts were selected to invite, as well as a district in at least every county in the state. Participants were given background information on the Diversity Strategies project and were divided into work groups and instructed to address a series of questions, including how they define diversity, the challenges to diversity, the principles that should inform a new policy, and various feedback on strategies presented by the Haas Institute, among other questions. All of the compiled research, including district-level feedback, was used to develop the Diversity Strategy Project recommendations, which under the direction of the State Board of Education of Ohio, informed the development of the new diversity policy and guidance. As part of the audit of the 1980 policy, Ohio recognized the need to update research that underpinned that policy. The educational landscape of Ohio in 2013 looks very different than that of 1980, and any contemporary and forward-looking diversity policy must reflect those differences. We will now take a look at a few of those findings. Ohio is a large, diverse state with large rural and urban areas, and with children from socioeconomically and linguistically diverse backgrounds. As is the case nationally, students of color are among the fastest growing populations in Ohio. In 2010, Ohio schools were 75% white, 16% African American, 4% multiracial, 3% Latino, 2% Asian, and 0.1% Native American. Asian and Latino students are among the fastest growing racial and ethnic subgroups. In 1980, Ohio was 1% Latino and less than 1/2% Asian. English language learners from all over the world are a rapidly growing subgroup as well. Ohio has more than 175,000 children from immigrant families, and 50,000 more than a decade ago. The diversity of English language learners' origins and language spoken presents both opportunities and challenges for educators in Ohio. Ohio is home to a rich religious and cultural heritage of more than 113 religious denominations. Ohio also has many unique challenges associated with its Appalachian region, an area with some of the highest concentrations of poverty in the nation, higher needs, and fewer resources. The Appalachian region has a dropout rate higher than the state average. People with disabilities make up the largest minority in America at 15% of the population. In Ohio, 14.6% of children in schools have a disability, and children with disabilities are 4 times more likely than non-disabled ones to have less than a 9th grade education. Although specific learning disabilities and speech and language disabilities are the largest portion of the student disability population, autism spectrum disorders pose unique challenges to educators and are the fastest growing disability over the past decade. Between 2000 and 2010, Ohio experienced growth in both autism diagnoses and the autism ratio in the 3 to 21 age group. Today, 1 in 88 children are diagnosed with autism. Among the most acute challenges in Ohio are economic and racial segregation. The socioeconomic diversity of Ohio's residential neighborhoods poses clear challenges for many of Ohio's school districts beyond the Appalachian region. Americans of varying economic backgrounds are less likely to reside in the same neighborhood or attend the same schools than a generation ago. Between 1970 and 2009, income segregation grew dramatically in the vast majority of national metropolitan regions. Critically, mixed income neighborhoods have grown less common, while affluent and poor neighborhoods have grown much more common. The share of the population in large and moderate-sized metro areas who live in the poorest and most affluent neighborhoods has more than doubled since 1970, while the share of families living in middle-income neighborhoods dropped from 65% to 44% in that time. Because of the linkages between socioeconomic status and educational performance, as well as the various neighborhood factors that influence educational outcomes, these trends pose stark challenges for Ohio's schools in coming decades. Schools, not just neighborhoods, are more segregated by class than a generation ago and have greater concentrations of poverty than before. More than 22% of school-age children in the United States live below the poverty line, and nearly half of today's school children qualify for free and reduced lunch pricing. These rates are disproportionately higher for children of color. The achievement gap between children from high and lower income families is greater than ever before. The challenge for educators is magnified when these students are concentrated into high poverty schools, where students with the greatest needs have fewer resources to meet those needs. In 2009, almost 40% of all American students were enrolled in schools with concentrated poverty. In Ohio's 6 largest metropolitan regions, over 50% of low-income students are segregated into high poverty or extremely high poverty schools. This has profound implications for the school's performance designation. Of all high poverty schools in Ohio's 6 largest urban counties, almost 95% are classified in academic emergency, academic watch, or continuous improvement. Nearly half of extremely high poverty schools are in academic emergency. Test scores in high poverty schools were 40% lower on average than test scores in non-high poverty schools. This is even true of students who live above the poverty line but attend high poverty schools, illustrating how the concentration of poverty affects more than those who live in poverty. While socioeconomic segregation is widening, U.S. public schools are now more than a decade into racial resegregation as well. Nearly 40% of Black and Latino students attend intensely segregated schools, in which 90 to 100% of students are minority. Almost 1 in 6 Black and Latino students are hyper-segregated and attend schools in which the student body is virtually all minority. Whites are the most isolated group of students, and Ohio is leading the nation in the increase of African American hyper-segregation in education. From 1993 to 2006, the percentage of Black students in nearly all minority schools, where there is less than 5% white, increased 18 percentage points to 28%. This increase is greater in Ohio than in any other state in the United States. These maps illustrate the distribution of families in Ohio by race and by rates of poverty, and the uneven distribution of these demographic facts in the state. The map on the left illustrates the concentration of non-white populations across the state. The light gray shaded areas are less than 10% non-white. The salmon shaded areas are between 10 to 50% non-white, and the dark gray shaded areas are over 50% non-white. The map on the right illustrates the concentrations of poverty in the state. The salmon shaded areas have between 10 to 50% of their families earning below the poverty line. The dark gray shaded areas are areas where over 50% of the families residing there earn below the federal poverty line. The light gray areas illustrate geographic areas with extremely low levels of poverty, under 10%. I will now highlight some findings concerning the importance of diversity and creating inclusive educational environments, particularly as this research relates to student performance, educational attainment, and successful schools. Diversity is a multidimensional concept that acknowledges and embraces the richness of human differences. When recognized and embraced as a community and school asset, diversity can provide a rich, academically stimulating, and socially engaging experience for children and young adults. Educators and administrators throughout the state have repeatedly affirmed the value and importance of diversity in relationship to a variety of educational goals, including preparing students to live in a diverse society and remaining competitive in a global economy. They define diversity inclusively to encompass a range of individual, familial, and community characteristics. Specifically, diversity encompasses, but is not limited to, race and ethnicity, national origin, gender, religion, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, familial status, disability, and linguistic diversity. Diversity serves social, educational, and civic ends. As the United States becomes a majority-minority nation, cultural fluency, competency, and familiarity with persons of different backgrounds and experiences will become an increasingly vital life skill. Diverse educational experiences generate many positive outcomes, including reduced stereotyping and prejudice, greater cultural fluency, and improved critical thinking skills. Students who must confront and navigate complex social settings and are prompted to develop perspective taking have improved problem-solving capacity, increased empathy and analytic ability, which translates into academic achievement and aspiration. Children with greater cultural fluency live and work in more integrated settings and have higher levels of civic engagement. The benefits of diversity flow back to the community. Research also shows that children feel more connected to inclusive schools. Research shows that children are more connected and engaged in schools with a warm, inclusive climate, but that these schools also have lower rates of drug use, violence, heavy drinking, smoking, and suicide attempts. Inclusivity also boosts academic performance. Students that have less stress or social anxiety perform better in school. A pubescent girl who is not worried about being harassed, or a boy who is unafraid of being teased because of his religion or sexual orientation will have improved attendance and better focus on schoolwork. The number one reason students skip school or play sick is to avoid bullies. Familiarity with other races, socioeconomic classes, religions, cultures, and other forms of diversity can increase empathy and reduce anxiety. Studies show that empathy among millennials has fallen sharply since 2000. Getting to know people who are different helps with perspective taking and reduces prejudice and negative stereotypes. These have tremendous social, civic, and educational benefits. producing more successful schools and stronger communities.
So Stephen, where can our audience go to for more information?
They can go to www.education.ohio.gov. ODE would like to invite you to now watch the webinar on the Diversity Strategies for Successful Schools Policy and Guidance to familiarize yourself with the policy and learn more about it, and how to improve diversity and achieve the benefits of diversity for your schools and your community. Please also take a moment to explore ODE's Diversity Strategies for Successful Schools webpage for more resources.
I want to thank you so much for sharing these absolutely fantastic ideas, which I'm sure are going to have a positive impact on our schools and in the future of Ohio public education. And thank you for joining us today as well. From the Ohio School Boards Association studio, for Mr. Menendian, I'm Crystal Davis.